welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by Claire Love Wilson and Peter Lorenz to hear all about Morag, You're a Long Time Deid, which has just finished a run at this year's Fringe. Hello, both.
Hello, Alistair.
I'm going to presume you're both exhausted after Edinburgh, and I'm interested to talk to you about that later on. But first, Claire, tell us about Morag, You're a Long Time Deid.
Yeah. Well, Morag, You're a Long Time Deid is it's an experimental musical where we take old Scottish ballads and remix them live on stage with loop pedals through a queer perspective. And the narrative follows a journey that's based on my own personal journey of a Scottish-Canadian character who's a granddaughter searching for Morag, who is a grandmother. It's the Scottish granny that she never met, whose story was silenced in her family. So the show is a journey of Sam, the granddaughter character, opening up and using these old ballads to try to imagine and invoke a connection with this grandmother and also her Scottish heritage.
And when people come along to it, what do they see? What's the kind of format that's on stage?
Yeah, so for the Fringe Festival, we built, quite a simplified version of the show, as you have to do. So what they'll just see is a piano. The show always has a real piano, and the piano really symbolizes the grandmother character of Morag. And then we've got a sound station that also moves, that has our loop equipment and some other things on it. Those are really the main two things that you'll see on stage. And we do a lot of creative things with these two these two elements. People will see, me up on top of the piano. They'll see the piano opened up. They'll see the piano spin. They'll see, the looping happen in different ways. They'll see vocal looping. They'll see, looping of sounds. One of our sort of challenges that we set for ourselves is to use those elements in as many ways as possible and in surprising ways for the audience that unfold as the show goes along.
And Peter, what's your role in the production?
I came on board very early in the process. I met Claire 10 years ago in Glasgow. Actually, it's a quite funny story. It was the Glasgow Art School club night, and we didn't know each other, and she was dancing in front of me and she slipped, and I ended up catching her, and that's how we met. And at that time, Claire wasn't even doing theatre, but she was in Scotland looking for her own grandmother's story. So when she told me about that, I was like, if you ever want to make this into a theatre piece, call me. And then some years later, after Claire had done some actors training, she called me up and was like, I actually want to make this show. And since then, we've been working together on it. So initially, I was kind of like a long distance, because Claire was back in Canada, I was in Scotland. Right. So I was a long distance dramaturg, I'd say, on the journey of the early exploration of the ideas. And then at the first workshop round, we tried some of the ideas and where I was a director. And then we went into another round of development with work in progress showings in Scotland and in Canada, where Claire and myself, we co-wrote the script. So I'm a co-writer, co-producer and director of the show. And funnily, right now, I just came back from Edinburgh as well. The last 3 shows, I had to step in on stage because Sally Sorry, the co-performer, the second person who is on stage, got ill on Thursday. So Thursday morning was time to step up my game and try to remember everything I had seen and written all these years. It was quite a interesting experience, but it was surprising how well it worked, how much I retained from just watching and directing.
How did he do, Claire?
Oh, he was brilliant, Alistair. He was brilliant. I was truly amazed by him. We had a 12 hours notice to turn this thing around, and we're able to just sort of mark through the show very quickly for an hour, and he managed to come up with piano parts. He was working the loop pedal. He was doing a character. He remembered all of the blocking. It was quite incredible.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that story about how you met, if they ever make a film of that's the kind of key scene, isn't it? Yeah. That's great. Interesting, you said about adapting it for Edinburgh. Did you have to adapt it quite a bit for Edinburgh in terms of time and not just the staging of it?
Yeah, so the first time we premiered it in full length was in Vancouver in 2022. and there was a 2-hour version with in a
wow.
community hall with cabaret style seating. It was the first production we did after the pandemic, so it was really all out. We wanted to show again what theatre can do, and we had this big community hall. So in Edinburgh we had a 4x4 meter stage. That's like not even 3 times the size of the piano. So we really reduced it in or boiled it down. It's a little bit like we made it, we like distilled an essence of the show. And I think that's actually it worked really well. So we're taking this version on tour, a two-hander version. Like in the original production, there were 4 people on stage, mainly supporting musicians. But now with the looping and the piano on stage, Sally and Claire, the 2 of them, do everything. And it's incredible how well it works. And also the story being boiled down a bit more condensed. It also it's good for the piece actually. And what we realized that it could even be boiled down more. The essence of Morag is the story and Claire's brilliant performance and storytelling and the music and all the rest around is a nice addition, makes it a beautiful show and a nice evening to enjoy. But what is touching is what we've created in the story.
Did you have to kind of get into the Edinburgh Hour? Was that the kind of time limit you had?
No, we managed to. Originally, that was what we were being asked to do. But then we said we felt confident that we could boil it down to 75 minutes, and that's where we're at now.
Okay, right. And Claire, Peter mentioned that you're taking it on tour. In fact, you are just about to take it on tour. Where are you going with it? That'd be good to mention that at this point.
Yeah, well, we're going. We've built a kind of UK and Ireland tour ourselves. This is Peter and my first time self-producing a tour of our own work. So we are going to Perth. I literally leave in an hour, like after this. We're going to Perth. We're going to Helmsdale up north to a theatre called Time Span. We're going to Greenock, to the Beacon Arts Centre. We're going to the Byre in St. Andrews. We're going to the Cat Strand down in New Galway. We're going to 3 locations in Ireland as well. And then we're finishing down south in London and Bristol.
And there's some great venues there, some of them I know, so that's tremendous.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about the inspiration behind the piece? You mentioned that it's linked to your own grandmother, but it'd be interesting to kind of really dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so basically, there's a lot of truth in the piece in terms of my own experience. I like to say that I kind of grew up with these 2 opposite experiences of grandmothers. On my mom's side, my mom's parents are Glaswegian, and my nana on my mom's side is very vivid. She's a vivid storyteller, and she sings songs, and I grew up with her very present in my life. She's very vivacious, and yeah, just always telling stories. And my dad's side of the family, I grew up without a grandmother because my grandmother died before I was born, and also nobody ever spoke about my grandmother. So I had this really contrary experiences of what grandmothers were. And as a sensitive, kid, I was always a bit like, what's up with this? And then when I got older, I learned that my grandmother, Marion, that she died by suicide when my dad was a teenager, and that she struggled with bipolar, and that there was just a lot of kind of grief and unprocessed trauma around her, which is why the family, why there was a lot of pain around sharing her story. But I carry her middle name. My middle name is Marion, and I just have felt always this kind of connection with her as a sort of spirit and ancestor. And that came to a sort of a culmination 10 years ago when I decided, I was like, I need to go to Scotland and find out more about that I come from this place, because all of my grandparents are Scottish and I had never been there. And B, I really felt this yearning to connect more with my grandmother's story and her spirit. And there was I felt this connection between us of like, there's, something of her in me that wants to be understood and explored. So I went for it and I moved to Scotland, and I started to do this kind of more embodied sort of searching for who my grandmother was, because there's very little available facts to me about her. It wasn't so much like a genealogy process as it was taking small little bits of information that I would get. For instance, I learned that she used to sing old ballads.
Right.
And so I then went into learning how to sing some of these old ballads. And in my process of learning old ballads, I realized that, you know, I loved some of these old songs, but that I also wanted to rewrite and reimagine some of them, because I would encounter, you know, sometimes lyrics that were very misogynistic or homophobic. And so there's this tension in the piece in Morag that comes from my own tension of going, okay, I want to connect to these stories and my lineages, but I also need to do it in my own way. And I want to reimagine some of the stuff that isn't working for me anymore. So all of that is true. And you really see that's really the basis for the show. And then in the show, we take this fictional direction where the character Sam goes into this kind of playful imaginary world of trying to understand more who her grandmother was. And that's where you get this queer story. Sam imagines that her grandmother had a lover who was called Jess, and she is kind of uncovering her grandmother's potential sort of secret love life as she's also uncovering her own her own voice and her own sexuality. So there's this kind of blending, and that's where we took it off into fiction. But the seed of the silenced grandmother and, you know, wanting and yearning to learn about her and having to use my imagination in order to do that is all part of my own story.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this idea of tradition, I think, excuse me, because I think we've got this, when people say tradition, that it's stayed and set and doesn't change, but actually, in terms of tradition do change, you know, things do change, and the ballads, and I mean, you know, people look back in Scotland, you know, a lot of Burns poetry and songs are rediscovered and revalued through a modern lens as well. Is that the kind of thing that you were doing when you were looking at these ballads?
Yeah, I was fortunate when I lived in Glasgow. Two people really influenced me in terms of my relationship to ballads. One is a performer and artist called Alistair Roberts, who who's an amazing ballad singer and songwriter. And I saw Alistair sing when I was in Glasgow, and I really felt a connection to the kind of way that he was taking the songs and like opening them up by the way he performed, but also with his imagination. And then my friend Rory Comerford is a composer and a musician here. And he also grew up singing ballads and doing Ceilidh, and him and I had conversations, and he said, yeah, you know, like actually with ballad singing, the way that he had learned it is rather than this idea that you have to do it the same every time, that just like a lot of sort of folk traditions, there's permission to adapt it to your audience, you know, and to actually, and then when I started looking at ballads, I started studying the child ballads collection, and I saw, oh, with each ballad, there's like 10 versions or there's 12 versions, and people have taken different verses, or they've maybe added in a local flair to, you know, something that's pertinent to them singing in a certain community or certain moment. So I took that as license to really say, you know what, I can learn these songs with respect, and part of respecting them is also challenging them, and is also saying, I'm going to ask some new questions, and I'm going to take some of the images and the verses in these songs, and I'm going to allow myself to play and imagine new possibilities for the old songs. And I personally think that kind of exchange with tradition is actually how traditions stay alive. Yeah. Not by keeping them sort of stagnant and in the same box, but by allowing them to be responsive to a contemporary moment and to people who can receive their wisdom, but then also take them in a new direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. And often these ballads originally were part of an oral tradition, so they were sung, you know, passed down family and all of these things, and from area to area as people travelled around. And I think that's exactly what happened, isn't it? Peter, can you talk a little bit about the collaborative nature of the piece? You know, because you've got this core idea, which is clearly very personal to Claire, but then how do you involve others in it?
Yeah, we always look at it in terms of like in like circles, like an onion. But in the most seat is Claire with her story, like her personal connection, and then the generosity of her opening that up, and for me supporting her. So that's the second circle of the two of us as creative collaborators, co-producers, and also co-writers. I think in a way is helping also Claire to let go a bit and give it a bit of a creative distance, so that gives a bit more license. That yes, we can take as much of the original story of the true events as we want to, as an inspiration, but we do not need to stick to it, and we can take them and give them a spin, or like turn it, invent some scenes, invent some characters. I mean, some of the, I'd say some of the most absurd scenes with Claire and her grandfather, we actually had to make less absurd than they are in reality to to make them work, because some of the reality is maybe more absurd than you can believe in the fiction. And I think that there's a part of generosity and trust that I'm really happy about that we found in our collaboration. And then I think that also gives it and allows it to the story to go even deeper and finds more universal aspects to it. And then there's a third layer of inviting others onto the piece. We've like all the preparation work has mainly been Claire and myself, and the writing. But then there's the other performers, both people that Claire mentioned, Alistair Roberts and Rory Comerford, used to work on the piece with us, mentored us, were performing. They both were in the role of the granddad at some point. And then, the journey continued. Both of them became fathers as well. And now we have a new performer who's actually the fourth grandfather and a new musical director. And it's with every time we invite new people in, new perspectives come on board, and without the old ones being thrown out. So we still sing some of the ballads in ways that Rory or Alistair had taught us, and we pay respect to them. And then there's still new perspectives coming in. And actually Rory Comerford has just he has done a remix of the ballads used in the show that we play in an epilogue, where after the show, all these songs come back in kind of a club version, and everybody's invited up on stage for a dance with Claire.
Oh, that sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. And the musical aspect of it, how did you approach that, Claire? Did you have ballads that you knew you were going to include, or does that change over the time, and was probably the change with the collaboration with others as well?
Yeah, it's honestly because we've been developing over time, it's happened quite organically. It started off with me just exploring a relationship with how I wanted to sing these ballads without much mentorship. And so I was just truly like in Canada, I went to my like auntie's place for like a week, and I just had the child ballads, and I sort of was going through, and I found, songs that I sort of felt called to. And then I would just go out for walks and sing them and come up with my own tune, because I didn't have a reference for the tune. I didn't go with the like, I'm going to look up the tune. I just went with like what feels like the tune of this song to me. And then that was how we sort of started with a couple of the ballads. And then I went into relationship with Peter and making the piece, and Alistair was brought on board. And he actually then introduced us, both Alistair and Rory introduced me to, there's two ballads in the show where I came up with my own tune, and then they showed me these other tunes that had a very different feel and sort of texture to them. So in the show, we have all the tunes. So you hear my original tunes, and then you'll hear these other versions of tunes that are a bit more common, and you feel them kind of how they talk to each other and are mashed together and create new things. So yeah, it kind of happened organically over time. And there's one ballad that Alistair introduced to us as well that we use in the show.
And one that Rory brought in.
One that Rory brought in as well. You're right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the show is also made up of all the creative gifts we have received by all the collaborators along the way.
I like to say that the show is about, an ancestor, and then in its making, we have all these creative ancestors that have contributed to the show that are there in its fabric, even though they're not necessarily physically there on stage.
But I mean, it does sound like in that sense, it can evolve in any way that you like, because I guess you're constantly discovering ballads or pieces of music that you maybe didn't know before. Does it change as it goes on?
I would say not in the way that you might imagine at the moment, like because it's like the writing is actually quite delicate, and the way that we written the show now over the last 6 years, and condense it and did a lot of like very close dramaturgical knitting and weaving. So all the ballads, we use essentially 4 ballads in the show, and they come back in different versions, but they're also there's points where it's just a ballad that's being sung, but then then the same ballad in a different tune against it, and then a whole scene coming out of the ballad. And in the dialogues as well, there's loads of tiny references, some in the imagery, some in the words to the ballads. And I think that actually you need to watch the show probably 5 times to like pick up on all of them. Or be a real expert on ballads, but it also, if you're not, it doesn't matter at all. Like you can still feel carried by that intricate weave, and maybe discover a couple of these moments. But it's not necessary to have all of them. But so it's the possibility to just introduce a new ballad would not really be possible due to this like very intense weaving.
So it's kind of tightly organized already, yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yes, definitely.
And like
all
Peter's
the scenes
saying,
correspond to each other and speak to each other.
yeah, the ballads are sort of fused with the writing.
Right.
So like Peter has said, the symbols in the ballads become different things as the show goes along, and they carry the narrative. So if we dropped in another ballad, we'd have to rewrite it.
It would change. Bring it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's interesting that because Peter, you'd said that it has been as much as 2 hours long, and then you've got it down to 75 minutes. So that's quite a edit.
Yeah, definitely. That's why we originally thought we wouldn't be able to make it to the Fringe hour, and it was quite an edit. But we just sat down together and were really harsh and seeing like what does something, what is maybe not necessary, and then we quite quickly understood what the core of the story is really, and what are the important elements, and then you can. I don't think that anything that we cut was bad or didn't work, but it was just less necessary than the other parts. And I think I was quite surprised actually then how once we started that and gave ourselves the permission, said like, actually there must be a 75 minutes version in this. It worked quite well.
And actually, was it quite? Did it become not a new show? Like, did you find things about it? That you
definitely. There's and I would say the biggest difference is the setting. It's not even the having it 75 minutes or 2 hours. The biggest difference was that the original premiere was in a community hall in a cabaret style, so the tables all around. The audience was sitting on tables, and the stage was 2 really long aisles that were perpendicular to each other. So a really strange stage space, but all the action, but really large, and all the action happened in this and amongst the audience. But this wasn't possible to continue, and there were some really beautiful moments about that. And in the new touring version, it's much more contained, also having only 2 people on stage. But there wouldn't even on the Fringe venue, there wouldn't even have in the space to have the 4 people on stage. So we discovered a lot in terms of what is possible and what is actually needed. It would always be great, if it would be financially feasible to have another 2 supporting musicians, but also on tour, that's just in the current economic climate not possible. But as the show works, we discovered of course that there are some things that work completely different in that audience setup of a cabaret style, but they also work in the thrust setup or the black box setup in let's say the Fringe or on tour. But then we also had to do some adaptations. But I would say the bigger adaptation than the spatial adaptation was also the adaptation to the audiences. In Canada, we were playing to Canadian audiences who some of them had Scottish roots or Scottish connections. But to be honest, I think hardly anyone has ever been to a Ceilidh before. And in the middle of the show, we imagine that the lead character goes to, she signs up to the Scottish Canadian Heritage Centre's Ceilidh event. And then to find out what, more about the tradition. And then what happens is that their Ceilidh caller appears and actually calls a Ceilidh, one song Ceilidh, on stage where the audience is invited up to participate. And in Canada, that was a whole different experience because people didn't know that tradition. And in Scotland, I would say most audience members had been to at least one, if not several Ceilidhs throughout their lives. And so we had to find also a container of how do you present that. So we emphasized more dramaturgically. We went into a space to really root that Ceilidh, this is happening in Canada, and the audience needs to understand that this is not, we're not trying to recreate a Ceilidh like it would happen in a community hall in the Highlands, but we are trying to show how this diaspora perspective of we're trying to imagine or we're trying to recreate and reconnect to these roots from afar without actually having too much of a connection with it.
That's really interesting. I thought about how the audience probably changes the show in itself.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, like even just doing it, it was really interesting, even just in our experience so far, before we were at the Fringe Festival, where we did this development was on the Isle of Mull, because we're co-producing this tour with An Tobar Mull Theatre, An Tobar Mull Theatre. And they were very, they've been great, generous collaboration partners. We're also presenting with a theatre company called the Frank Theatre, a queer theatre company in Vancouver. But we all came to Mull to do this redevelopment. So we were based on Mull for 3 weeks and redeveloping the show to this kind of new format. And then we previewed the show on Mull. So we did 4 shows. We did 2 at Mull Theatre itself, and then we went and took it to community halls in different rural communities there. And it was so interesting, to do the show, to kind of start this version of the show in, I mean, in some ways, Mull is like kind of quite cosmopolitan in the summer because there's a lot of people who visit and who are tourists, and a lot of people have moved there from elsewhere. But, there was also audience members at some of our shows there who are, from Mull for 3 generations and have such a certain, or 4 generations, or as long as you can remember, and have such a kind of specific relationship to, a ballad singing tradition or Ceilidh and what that means to them. And I was honestly, Fringe was its whole own sort of environment, but I was honestly like kind of the most nervous about presenting to those audiences, because I was like, oh, we're coming in with this pretty bold proposition that you can really take these songs and spin them around and put in queer storylines and, and add loop pedals and remix them. And it's quite experimental, musically and narratively. So yeah, with those audiences, it was interesting. I found on Mull, people were quite like, the audiences were quite, I don't want to say reserved in a bad way. They were just sort of really watching, like really observant, but a bit quieter. And so as a performer, I would sort of be like, oh gosh, I hope this is, okay. And then afterwards, it would be this just outpouring of people coming up to me and saying, this is what I thought, and this is what it's connected to for me. And this made me think of this person in my family, and you sung this song in this way, and it made me think this. Like, I just felt like they had a lot to bring to it in terms of how they were watching. Whereas doing it in a Fringe context, completely different. You have audiences from all around the world. You have people that are used to this experimental sort of work and format. And so the way they were engaging is different. And I'm really excited about going on tour and just seeing how in each place and each audience and the way they're going to relate to this idea of remixing or reimagining traditions. I think it's going to be also, for instance, very different when we go over to Ireland. That's going to be its whole own context, and then down south and different communities in Scotland. And I think that's what's quite exciting, is that the show can speak to people who have a connection with these traditions, but also in Vancouver and at the Fringe and even on Mull, we really saw that people who don't have connection to Scottishness at all, like people from Italy, people from Spain and Vancouver, people who have heritage from India or who are indigenous to the lands that Canada is on. This theme of reimagining your ancestral connection and needing to find your roots, but not in a romanticized way, like in a way that's really going, where did my people come from and what does that mean to me? And how do I actually carry that on now in a contemporary context in my life in a way that's relevant to me and going to serve my community? I think that it's a question that people are just asking all over the world in relationship to, a lot of systemic change and a lot of systemic collapse of like old systems. And So I think that theme of kind of ancestry and what it means and what it needs to mean is live for people from so many different backgrounds. And that's what we found when we present Morag.
I guess it's this idea of conversations across generations that everyone can identify with. You know,
Yes.
we've all got those. And I think that's kind of, I can see why with audience members, it'll hit, you know, every one of them, perhaps in a different way, but make them think of their own grandparents or beyond, or, you know, their own backstories, if you like. It's very rare that I get to talk to anyone who's just at the end of the Edinburgh Fringe. Usually it's people are just beginning and they're talking about their shows and they're really enthusiastic. How was it? How was it now that you're done? you still look okay. I'm guessing, you know, you've made it.
We survived it. It was wild. I mean, it's such an intense environment, and it can be really grinding at points. You're up every day doing the show. You know, you don't have your 15 minutes to get into the space, set everything up, and then you do the show, and then 15 minutes to put everything down, and then flying on the ground. So many connections. So just the sheer amount of people you're surrounded with every day. I think as a visitor, it's almost sometimes hard to be in Edinburgh for longer than a couple of days, but we're there for, like, for 3-4 weeks. But it's been also really, really inspiring to see the work flourish and see the work develop through performance and really settle, and see audience members come in. It's been really hard sometimes to get audience members in because there's so many shows, and we had a slot at around lunchtime, but also seeing that how slowly it managed to pick up, and the word of mouth spread, and then more people started coming, and random people started coming because they heard about it or because they read about it and were called to it. And the most beautiful thing for me was to see that almost everybody who came out was touched or moved in some way and felt something. I mean, quite a few people cried as well. A lot of people laughed and cried. And I think nowadays it's quite a special thing if audience members are really moved and transported somewhere and feel something, think something, and have a real communal experience together, because it's a show that is really happening also in the heads of the audience and together with the audience. And that's been really inspiring, seeing that every day, not just as a director. Normally you leave after the first show, and then you don't know, you hear how it's been going. But I've never seen any of my shows like be performed that much and be able to be there and see the audiences coming out, seeing their eyes, hearing their responses, and that's been really inspiring.
Yeah, because I was thinking it's probably the only chance you get to do the show for 20 odd days in a row, that kind of thing. And of course it's intense, but it really, I guess, gets you to hone the show. It's almost like a boot camp of doing theatre, is that right?
Yeah, totally. I
Absolutely.
mean, by the end, I even knew how to perform the show without having been in it.
Exactly. That's the level of boot camp kind of insanity, which is that Peter literally just stepped in and we could still do it. And I think the show has really, I think with the Fringe, one of the gifts of the Fringe is that, like, you know, the show has really settled into a shape that now is, you know, as a performer and with my co-performer Sal, and then again, even with Peter, there's now this really intuitive quality to everything that's happening. And it's almost, you know, it's got that feeling of things are moving and happening as if we're not doing it, like it's just happening. And the way you get to that, you know, the way you get to that is repetition and getting to bring fresh energy to every show and every time. So you're always discovering new things. And again, with Morag, it's such a gift because of the audience involvement. Every show is different.
Yeah.
You know, it's because the audience is, we like to say that it's like a co-creative experience with the audience. And so it does retain that freshness. But yeah, the show, you know, Peter had said the word distilled, and it's like it became an even finer whiskey, you know, after Fringe, because it just got even more sort of specific in all of the little movements. And as much as the Fringe in itself, it's kind of a contrast because the Fringe environment is so chaotic. It's so like everything everywhere all at once all the time. You're always pulled in 1900 zillion directions. But in a way, if you're able to focus on your little piece of magic that you're creating in that room with those people, every single day in this pretty pressurized environment. So it's also like the pressure kind of, you know, squeezes everything and concentrates. And then there's really magic that got created there with our audiences. And I think the show is better for it artistically.
It's actually the only time that you're not kind of thinking about all other things going on is when you're on stage. That's almost your kind of moment of escape. Well,
Yeah.
That's really what I discovered when I had to step in. Yeah. When I had to step in on stage after being at the Fringe for a while, and only feeling that like being pulled and being everywhere and like, you know, having to market the shows. When I had to step in, I really enjoyed it. I was amazed that I was really calm. It felt like a meditation for once. You get like an hour in the day where you can be just fully present.
Oh, yeah, like a kind of really scripted meditation almost.
Yes.
Exactly, like a long visualization. It is really though, like I think, you know, I don't know if I totally understood in terms of actually committing to that, kind of keeping the focus on that space and that magic that you're creating with your team and with the audience requires a lot of mental fortitude in the Fringe environment, because the distractions are constant. And there's also a feeling of, you know, it's very easy to be tempted to be pulled into comparison all the time at every moment, because you're walking down the street and you just see all the posters of everybody's shows and all the stars they're getting and all the reviews, and also the economic element of it is quite brutal, you know, in terms of like the majority of the artists that are there are actually losing money. You know, the venues are, we really loved our venue. We were at Zoo's Southside, and they're just an amazing bunch of people, actually really kind of community and artist oriented place. It was a great community to do the show in. And also, you know, it's still really expensive to rent those venues, to put up your artists in Edinburgh, for the food. So there's a palpable feeling of people being stressed also, like financially. And that element of it is, you know, puts an added pressure that can really take away from that artistic focus, right? And so I really found, wow, I had to like, you know, I was kind of had to be quite monk-like in some ways, you know, sometimes, of making sure that I really take myself out of the environment as a performer and doing a lot of kind of grounding activities and things to really help me remember why I'm here, what I'm focused on, what's my main job, and all that noise, you know, when you get into your show. You know, ideally it needs to melt away, but if you're not kind of doing that work of centering yourself, it's hard, because you're pulled in so many directions. And also, yeah, there can be this feeling of that you're not doing enough, or, you know, that kind of thing can be really tempting to get into that. So that was a really interesting learning of like how to actually keep the focus and stay centered amidst an environment that is truly so sort of decentering in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it would be easy to kind of lose yourself in everything else when it's the work itself which is the important thing.
Yeah, totally.
And what we can say is people that are going to come now and see you on tour, it's going to be the most drilled version it's ever been. They're really going to get the best version. Where can people find out the tour dates again? Is there a website that they can go to?
Absolutely. Yeah, we can. I don't know if you have like show notes or something, but we can, my website, which is clairelovewilson.com, it has a page for Morag, and all of the tour dates are listed there with links to all of the tickets, every single theater. So that's kind of the best landing page to go. But also if you're, you know, in a local community, you can find us as well. We're listed on all of the theaters that we're going to, but that's the landing page, is my website with the sort of Morag page, and I can give you that link to share with audiences.
And yeah, on the post that will accompany the podcast, I'll make sure that we get the links to everything on your social media pages as well, so people can follow you.
Amazing.
Claire and Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and squeezing me into your genuinely busy schedule. I do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Alistair. It's been a pleasure.
The
It's a joy to get to share about the work and the journey. So really appreciative of you having us on.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, and all the best with Morag going forward. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.